The secret ingredient. In their attempts to justify the existence of a ruling class government, states often describe perfectly reasonable, legitimate, useful things and then proclaim them to be government. They may argue, once people cooperate to form an organized system of mutual defense, that's government. Or they may claim, when people collectively decide the way things like roads and commerce and property rights will work in their town, that's government. Or they may say, when people pool their resources to do things collectively rather than each individual having to do everything for himself, that is government. None of these statements are true. Such assertions are intended to make government sound like a natural, legitimate, and useful part of human society. But all of them completely miss the fundamental nature of government. Government is not organization, cooperation, or mutual agreement. Countless groups and organizations, supermarkets, football teams, car companies, archery clubs, etc., engage in cooperative, mutually beneficial collective actions, but they are not called government because they are not imagined to have the right to rule. And that is the secret ingredient that makes something authority, the supposed right to forcibly control others. Governments do not just evolve out of supermarkets or football teams, nor do they evolve out of people preparing and providing for their mutual defense. This is a fundamental difference between how can we effectively defend ourselves and I have the right to rule you. Contrary to what civics textbooks may claim, governments are not the result of either economics or basic human interaction. They do not just happen as the result of people being civilized and organized. They are entirely the product of the myth that someone has to be in charge. Without the superstition of authority, no amount of cooperation or organization would ever become government. It requires a drastic change in public perception for a service provider, whether the service is food, shelter, information, protection, or anything else, to transform into a rightful ruler. A system of organization cannot magically become government any more than a security guard can magically become a king. And that fact relates to another claim of status, that doing away with government would simply result in violent gangs gaining power, which would in turn become the new government. But violent conquest does not naturally become government any more than peaceful cooperation does. Unless the new gang is imagined to have the right to rule, it will not be seen as government. In fact, the ability to control modern populations, especially armed populations, depends entirely upon the perceived legitimacy of the would-be controllers. Today, to rule any population of significant size by brute force alone would require an enormous amount of resources, weapons, spies, mercenaries, etc. So much so that it would be nearly impossible. The specter of a gang of ruthless thugs taking over a country may make for an entertaining movie, but it cannot actually happen in a country equipped with even the most basic communications and firearms. The only way to control a large population today is for the would-be ruler to first convince the people that he has the moral right to exert control over them. He can acquire dominion only if he can first hammer the myth of authority into the intended victims' heads, thereby convincing his victims that he is a legitimate and proper government. If he can accomplish that, very little actual force will be required for him to acquire and maintain power. But if his regime ever loses legitimacy in the eyes of the victims, or if he never achieves it to begin with, brute force alone will not provide him with any lasting power. In short, neither gangs nor cooperatives can ever become government unless the people believe that someone has the right to rule them. Likewise, Once the people, as a whole, free themselves from the myth of authority, they will not need any revolution to be free. Government will simply cease to exist because the only place it has ever existed is in the minds of those who believed in the superstition of authority. Again, the politicians and the mercenaries who carry out their threats are very real, but without perceived legitimacy. They are recognized as a gang of power happy thugs, not a government. It should also be mentioned that some have claimed, including Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, that it is possible and desirable to have a government which does nothing except protect the rights of individuals. But an organization which did only that which would not be government. Each individual has the right to defend himself and against attackers. To exercise that right, even through a very organized large scale operation, would not be government, any more than an organized large scale food production constitutes government. For something to be government, it must, by definition, do something the average person, that, that average people do not have the right to do. A government with the same rights as everyone else is not a government any more than the average man on the street is government.